He'd built a quiet life on 10 acres of hard-won peace, a former Marine, a single father, and a man who asked for nothing but to be left alone. But when a convoy of black SUVs rolled onto his property without permission, and a billionaire heiress stepped out flanked by armed security, everything he'd fought to protect was suddenly on the line. What started as a boundary dispute became something far more dangerous and far more unexpected. She was untouchable, surrounded by wealth and walls no ordinary man could breach. He was unbreakable, forged by war and fatherhood into something her money couldn't buy. In a single moment of confrontation, two worlds collided. Was it a clash that would destroy them both, or the beginning of something neither saw coming? If you believe some encounters are too powerful to ignore, stay with us until the very last word. And don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The valley stretched wide and green beneath a sky so clear it hurt to look at. 10 acres of rolling pasture land bordered by oak trees older than memory. A 2-story farmhouse with white shutters that needed paint, and a barn that leaned just enough to show its age but not enough to fall. This was the kind of place where a man could breathe without someone watching, where the only sounds were wind through grass and the distant call of hawks. Weston Doyle stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, boots planted on weathered wood that had known 3 generations of his family. The morning sun cut long shadows across the driveway, and for a moment, everything was exactly as it should be, peaceful, quiet. Then he heard the engines, not 1, but 3. The low, synchronized rumble of expensive machinery moving in formation. Weston set his mug down on the porch rail and narrowed his eyes toward the dirt road that led to his property. A convoy of black SUVs emerged from the tree line, their polished surfaces gleaming like beetles in the sun. They moved with the kind of precision that spoke of training, of coordination, of people who were used to getting where they wanted to go without asking permission. Weston's jaw tightened. He didn't move from the porch, didn't call out, didn't wave. He just watched as the vehicles rolled past the faded "No Trespassing" sign he'd posted at the property line and continued up his driveway, as if they owned the place. The lead SUV stopped 20 feet from his porch. The other 2 flanked it in a wide V formation, engines still running. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the rear door of the center vehicle opened, and a woman stepped out. She was tall, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Weston's truck. Her dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested control down to the smallest detail. Her heels clicked against the gravel as she took 3 steps forward, then stopped, waiting as if the world would rearrange itself to suit her schedule. From the passenger side of the same SUV, a man emerged, broad-shouldered, wearing a tactical vest over a black shirt, sunglasses that hid his eyes, and the kind of expression that said he was paid to solve problems before they became problems. He didn't speak, just positioned himself 2 steps behind the woman and scanned the property with the methodical attention of someone trained to assess threats. 2 more men stepped out from the flanking vehicles. Same build, same gear, same posture. Security, professional, armed, though they kept their hands visible and their weapons holstered. Weston didn't flinch. He'd seen worse than 3 guys in tactical vests. He'd been worse than 3 guys in tactical vests. The woman tilted her head slightly, as if noticing him for the first time, though he knew damn well she'd clocked him the moment her vehicle crested the hill. She took a breath, smoothed the front of her jacket, and spoke. "Good morning. My name is Sienna Elliott. I represent Elliott Global Holdings. I believe there's been some confusion regarding the property boundaries in this area, and I'd like to discuss a potential resolution that benefits both parties." Her voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of tone that had closed deals in boardrooms across the country. But there was something else underneath it. A faint thread of expectation, as if she was already certain this conversation would end the way she wanted. Weston took his time. He lifted his coffee mug, took a slow sip, then set it back down on the railing. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, flat, and edged with the kind of patience that comes just before it runs out. There's no confusion. This is my land. Has been for 30 years. You're standing on it without permission. Sienna's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or irritation. She glanced at the man beside her, who pulled a tablet from a shoulder bag and tapped the screen a few times before handing it to her. According to county records, she said. Her tone still measured. There's a disputed easement running through this section of the valley. My company has been in negotiations with the previous landowner to secure access rights for a development project. I was under the impression those negotiations were ongoing. Weston stepped down from the porch. Not fast, not aggressive, just deliberate. The kind of movement that said he wasn't going to be talked down to from 20 feet away. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, hands loose at his sides, and looked at her directly. The previous landowner sold me this property 8 years ago. Clean title. No easements. No disputes. If someone told you otherwise, they lied. The lead security officer shifted his weight. Just a fraction, but enough that Weston noticed. His hand didn't move toward his weapon, but the message was clear. They were ready if this went sideways. Sienna handed the tablet back to her associate and took a half step forward. Her heels sank slightly into the gravel, but she didn't seem to notice. Her focus was entirely on Weston now, assessing him the way someone might assess a piece of machinery that wasn't functioning as expected. Mr. Doyle, I'm not here to create conflict. I'm here to find a solution. If there's been a miscommunication, we can sort that out. But I do need access to this land. My team has already begun surveying the northern ridge, and we're on a very tight timeline. Weston's eyes darkened. Your team is where? The northern ridge, she repeated, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. We've been working there for the past 3 days. I assumed you were aware. For a moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the oaks and the low idle of the SUV engines. Weston's hands didn't ball into fists, but his shoulders squared in a way that made the security team tense. You've been on my land. For 3 days. Without asking. Sienna's composure slipped, just barely. A faint crease appeared between her brows. We were told the access rights were being finalized. If that information was incorrect, I apologize. But the work is underway, and stopping now would cost my company a significant amount of money. I'm prepared to offer compensation for any inconvenience. Weston took another step forward. Not threatening, but closing the distance enough that the conversation became something other than a business transaction shouted across gravel. I don't want your money. I want you off my property. The security officer on Sienna's left shifted his stance. His voice was low, professional, directed at Weston but clearly meant for everyone. Sir, let's keep this civil. Ms. Elliott is trying to resolve this respectfully. Weston turned his gaze to the man. There was no heat in it, no anger. Just the kind of cold, steady focus that comes from years of making life or death decisions in the span of a heartbeat. Civil is me asking you to leave. Uncivil is what happens if you're still here in 5 minutes. Sienna raised a hand, a subtle gesture that stopped her security officer from responding. She studied Weston for a long moment, and for the first time since she'd stepped out of that SUV. Something like curiosity crossed her face. You're serious? As a heart attack. She glanced back at the vehicles, then at the ridge beyond the barn where her survey team was presumably still working. When she looked at Weston again, her expression had shifted. Less boardroom, more calculation. I'll pull my team off the ridge, today, but I'm not walking away from this project. If we can't come to an agreement, I'll pursue this through legal channels. Weston's voice didn't rise, but it didn't soften either. You do what you need to do. But until a judge tells me otherwise, this land is mine. And the next time you want to have a conversation, you call first. You don't roll up with an armed escort like you're storming a compound. For a beat, neither of them moved. The space between them held all the tension of two people who had lived very different lives suddenly forced to occupy the same moment. Then Sienna nodded once, a sharp controlled motion, and turned toward her vehicle. We'll be in touch, Mr. Doyle. She climbed into the SUV without waiting for a response. The door closed with a heavy thunk. The security team filed back into their respective vehicles with the same disciplined efficiency they'd arrived with. Engines revved. Gravel crunched. And within 60 seconds, the convoy was rolling back down the driveway, leaving nothing but dust and the faint smell of exhaust. Weston stood there until the last vehicle disappeared beyond the tree line. Then he turned, walked back up the porch steps, and picked up his coffee. It had gone cold, but he drank it anyway. His eyes still fixed on the dirt road, as if he could will the whole encounter into something that hadn't just happened. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. A boy, maybe 10 years old, with tousled brown hair and a t-shirt that had seen better days, stepped out onto the porch. He looked at his father, then at the empty driveway, then back at his father. Who was that? The boy asked. Weston set the mug down and exhaled slowly. Trouble. The town of Ashford sat in the crook of the valley like a worn-out boot, comfortable and familiar, but showing its age. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks, lined with brick storefronts that had been there since before the interstate rerouted most of the traffic. A hardware store, a diner with a neon sign that flickered on rainy nights, a post office that doubled as the town's gossip exchange, and a small grocery where everyone knew your name and your business. Weston pulled his truck into the gravel lot behind the diner and cut the engine. The boy in the passenger seat, his son Eli, was already unbuckling his seatbelt, eyes on the door like a dog who knew where the good scraps came from. Can I get pancakes? Eli asked. You had cereal 2 hours ago. That was breakfast. This is second breakfast. Weston shook his head, but there was a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You've been watching too many movies. They climbed out of the truck and headed inside. The diner smelled like coffee and bacon grease, the kind of smell that lived in the walls and the vital booth seats. A bell chimed above the door as they entered, and the woman behind the counter looked up with a grin that could light up a cave. Weston Doyle, as I live and breathe. Twice in 1 week. You trying to make me think you're sociable? Her name was Tessa McCarthy, and she'd been running the diner since her father passed 10 years ago. She was sharp-tongued, quick with a coffee pot, and had a memory for faces that bordered on supernatural. Just feeding the kid, Weston said, sliding into a booth by the window. Eli climbed in across from him and immediately started building a tower out of the sugar packets. Tessa walked over with 2 menus, though she didn't bother handing them out. She already knew what they'd order. Heard you had some fancy visitors this morning, she said, pouring coffee into the mug in front of Weston without asking. Black SUVs, suits, the whole parade. Weston raised an eyebrow. Word travels fast. Honey, in this town, word travels before it even happens. So what did they want? Weston glanced at Eli, who was now stacking creamer cups on top of the sugar packets with the kind of focus usually reserved for diffusing bombs. He lowered his voice just enough to keep the conversation between adults. They think they own my land. Or part of it. Some development company trying to push through. Tessa's expression darkened. Elliott Global? Weston's eyes sharpened. You know them? Know of them. They've been sniffing around the county for months. Bought up half the ridge on the east side. Started surveying land they don't own yet. Talking about resorts and luxury housing. Lot of folks are nervous. They should be. Tessa leaned against the edge of the booth, arms crossed. You planning to fight them? Planning to keep what's mine. She studied him for a moment, then nodded with the kind of approval that only comes from people who've known you long enough to see past the armor. Good, someone needs to. Most folks around here will roll over the second a lawyer waves a checkbook in their face. Ellie's tower collapsed, and he let out a dramatic sigh. Tessa grinned and tousled his hair. Pancakes, kiddo? Yes, please. And for you? She asked, looking at Weston. Same, and keep the coffee coming. Tessa walked back toward the kitchen, and Weston turned his gaze out the window. The street was quiet, just a few cars parked in front of the hardware store. An old man sweeping the sidewalk in front of the post office. Normal, ordinary, the kind of place where people still waved at each other and remembered when your birthday was. Eli leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Dad, are we in trouble? Weston looked at his son. The kid had his mother's eyes, bright and curious, and a way of asking questions that cut straight to the bone. He'd been through enough change in his short life. Lost his mom to cancer when he was 6, moved from base to base during Weston's final years in the service, and finally landed here when Weston decided he was done with orders and wars and everything that came with them. This land, this house, this quiet life, it was supposed to be the place where trouble stopped finding them. No, Weston said, his voice steady. We're not in trouble. But some people think they can take what isn't theirs. And we're not going to let them. Eli nodded, satisfied with that answer in the way kids are when they trust the person giving it. Across town, in a hotel suite that cost more per night than most people in Ashford made in a week, Sienna Elliott stood in front of a wall of windows overlooking the valley. Her reflection stared back at her, sharp and composed, but her mind was elsewhere. The meeting with Weston Doyle had not gone the way she'd planned. She was used to negotiations, used to people who postured and demanded, but ultimately folded when the numbers got big enough. Weston hadn't postured. He hadn't demanded. He'd simply said no, and meant it. Behind her, a woman in her mid-50s sat at the suite's dining table, laptop open, fingers moving across the keyboard with the kind of speed that suggested she'd been doing this for decades. Her name was Kendall Harper, and she was Sienna's chief of operations. If Sienna was the face of Elliott Global, Kendall was the engine. Legal says the easement claim is shaky at best, Kendall said without looking up. The previous owner never signed the final documents. It was all verbal, and verbal doesn't hold up in court. Not in this county anyway. Sienna didn't turn around. What about eminent domain? Possible, but it'll take months. Maybe longer. And the optics are terrible. You start seizing land from a single-father veteran in a small town, and the press will bury you. Sienna's jaw tightened. She'd built her company by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than everyone else in the room. But she'd also built it by knowing when to pivot, when to adapt, and when to recognize that brute force wasn't the only tool in the box. Then we go a different route, she said. Find out everything about Weston Doyle, his finances, his history, his vulnerabilities. There's always leverage. We just have to find it. Kendall's fingers paused on the keyboard. You sure you want to do this? Guy seemed pretty dug in. Sienna turned, her expression cool and unreadable. I didn't get where I am by walking away the first time someone said no. Kendall resumed typing, and Sienna returned her gaze to the window. Somewhere out there, on 10 acres of land she needed to make her project work, was a man who'd looked her in the eye and told her to leave. No negotiation. No compromise. Just a line in the dirt and the quiet certainty that he'd defend it. Most men she dealt with wanted something. Money, status, recognition. She could work with want. But Weston Doyle didn't want anything from her. And that made him dangerous in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her phone buzzed. A text from her head of security. Survey team pulled off the ridge. No incidents. Awaiting further instructions, she typed back a single word. Standby. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the valley. And in the space between two worlds, one built on wealth and power, the other on soil and stubbornness, a line had been drawn. Neither side knew yet how deep it would cut, or what it would cost to hold. The law office of Brennan and Associates sat on the second floor of a brick building that had once been a bank. The original vault door still stood in the back hallway, now used to store old case files and forgotten wills. The waiting room smelled like coffee and old paper. And the chairs were the kind that made you sit up straight, whether you wanted to or not. Weston sat in one of those chairs. Hat in his hands, boots leaving faint dust marks on the worn carpet. Across from him, behind a desk cluttered with folders and a computer that looked older than Eli, sat Roland Brennan, the only attorney in Ashford who didn't work for the county or the bank. Roland was in his 60s. Gray-haired, with glasses that slid down his nose every time he leaned forward to read something. He'd handled Weston's property purchase 8 years ago. And he'd done it with the kind of thoroughness that made you trust him even when the news wasn't good. Right now, the news wasn't good. They're not bluffing, Roland said, tapping a stack of papers on his desk. Elliott Global filed a formal claim with the county yesterday. They're arguing that the previous landowner entered into a verbal agreement granting them access rights to the northern section of your property. They've got affidavits, survey maps, even a few emails that suggest negotiations were ongoing. Weston's expression didn't change, but his knuckles went white around the brim of his hat. Verbal agreements don't mean anything. Verbal agreements don't mean anything. In most cases, you'd be right. But they're not just claiming a verbal agreement. They're claiming it was part of a larger transaction that was interrupted when the previous owner passed away. They're arguing that the intent was clear and that you inherited not just the land, but the obligations attached to it. That's garbage. It is, Roland agreed. But it's expensive garbage. They've got a legal team that could tie this up in court for years. And even if you win, you'll spend a fortune getting there. Weston set his hat on his knee and exhaled slowly. So what are my options? Roland leaned back in his chair, the springs creaking under his weight. Option 1, you fight it. We file a counterclaim, argue that there was no binding agreement, and force them to prove their case in court. It'll cost you, but you've got a strong position. Clean title, no recorded easements, and a seller who never signed anything. And option 2? You negotiate. Let them have limited access to the ridge in exchange for compensation. It's not ideal, but it keeps you out of court and puts money in your pocket. Weston's jaw tightened. I'm not selling pieces of my land to people who think they can just take what they want. Roland nodded as if he'd expected that answer. Then we fight. But I need you to understand what that means. Elliott Global has deep pockets and a reputation for grinding people down. They'll drag this out, file motion after motion, and make it as painful as possible. You need to be ready for that. Weston stood, picking up his hat and settling it back on his head. I've been through worse than a legal fight, Roland. Just tell me what you need from me. Documentation. Anything you've got on the original sale. Communication with the previous owner. Records of improvements you've made to the land. The more we can show that you've been the sole owner and operator of this property, the stronger our case. I'll get it to you. Roland stood as well, extending his hand. Weston shook it, and for a moment, the two men stood there in the quiet of the old office, the weight of what was coming settling between them like dust. One more thing, Roland said. Be careful. Companies like Elliott Global don't just fight in courtrooms. They fight in the press, in the community, anywhere they can get leverage. If they think they can pressure you into backing down, They will. Weston's expression was carved from stone. Let them try. He left the office and walked down the stairs to the street. The afternoon sun was high and hot, and the town moved at its usual unhurried pace. But something felt different now. The air had a charge to it, like the moments before a storm breaks. His truck was parked across the street, and as he crossed, he noticed a figure leaning against the passenger door. A woman, mid-30s, dressed in jeans and a blazer, her dark hair pulled into a ponytail. She had a camera hanging from a strap around her neck and a notebook tucked under one arm. "Mr. Doyle?" She called out as he approached. Weston stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" She pushed off the truck and extended a hand. "Piper Stone. I'm a reporter with the Valley Observer. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about the situation with Elliott Global." Weston didn't take her hand. "No comment." Piper lowered her hand but didn't back off. "I understand you're in a difficult position, but this story is bigger than just your property. Elliott Global has been moving through this county like a steamroller, and a lot of people are scared. If you're willing to stand up to them, that's news. I'm not looking to be news. I get that. But whether you like it or not, you already are. They filed their claim publicly. It's part of the county record. People are talking." Weston's hand moved to the door handle, but he paused. "What people?" "Neighbors. Business owners. Folks who've been watching Elliott Global buy up land and push out anyone who won't sell. You're not the first person they've gone after, Mr. Doyle, but you might be the first one with the guts to say no and mean it." Weston studied her for a long moment. She didn't flinch, didn't smile, just met his gaze with the kind of steady patience that said she'd wait as long as it took. "I've got nothing to say that'll help your story," he said finally. "Maybe not. But if you change your mind, here's my card." She pulled a business card from her pocket and held it out. When he didn't take it, she set it on the hood of his truck and stepped back. "For what it's worth," she added, "I think you're doing the right thing." Weston didn't respond. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb, leaving Piper Stone standing on the sidewalk with her notebook and her camera and a story that was just beginning to take shape, back at the hotel suite. Sienna stood in front of a presentation screen, watching as Kendall walked her through the latest updates. Survey data, environmental reports, projected timelines. Everything was on track except for one 10-acre plot of land sitting right in the middle of the access route they needed. "We can reroute," Kendall said, gesturing to the map. "It adds 3 months to the timeline and increases costs by 15%, but it's doable." "No," Sienna said. "We're not rerouting. We're not delaying. We're solving this." Kendall closed her laptop and looked at Sienna with the kind of expression that comes from years of working together. "You're taking this personally. I'm taking it seriously. There's a difference, is there?" Sienna turned away from the screen and walked to the window. The valley stretched out below her, green and quiet and completely indifferent to her plans. Somewhere out there, Weston Doyle was going about his day, feeding his son, fixing fences, living a life that had nothing to do with her. And yet, their lives were now tangled in a way neither of them had asked for. "He doesn't trust me," Sienna said quietly. Kendall raised an eyebrow. "Should he?" Sienna didn't answer. Instead, she picked up her phone and scrolled through the background report her team had compiled on Weston Doyle, former Marine, honorably discharged, widower, single father. No criminal record, no debt, no scandals. Just a man who'd bought a piece of land and wanted to be left alone. The report also included a note at the bottom, flagged by her head of security. Subject shows signs of advanced tactical awareness. Recommend caution in any direct engagement. Sienna set the phone down and exhaled slowly. She'd built an empire by reading people, by finding their pressure points and applying just enough force to get what she needed. But Weston Doyle didn't have the usual pressure points. He didn't want her money. He didn't care about her influence. And he wasn't intimidated by her security team that left only one option. She'd have to change tactics. Not force. Not pressure. Something else. Set up a meeting, she said, turning to Kendall. Not at his property. Somewhere neutral. The diner in town, maybe. Make it informal. Just me and him. Kendall looked skeptical. You think he'll show? He will, because he's curious. And because he wants to know what I'm really after. And what are you really after? Sienna's expression was unreadable. A solution. One that works for both of us. Kendall didn't look convinced, but she nodded and pulled out her phone to make the arrangements. Outside, the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills, and the shadows grew longer across the valley. The chess pieces were moving into position, and neither player was willing to concede the board. The diner was quieter than usual for a Thursday evening. Most of the regulars had already come and gone, leaving behind empty coffee cups and the faint smell of fried onions. Tessa stood behind the counter, wiping down the surface with a rag that had seen better days. Her eyes darting toward the clock every few minutes. Weston sat in the corner booth. The same one he always chose when he came here. It gave him a clear view of the door and the parking lot beyond. Old habits. Ellie was at home with Mrs. Brennan, Roland's wife, who'd offered to watch him for the evening. She hadn't asked why, and Weston hadn't explained. Small towns had a way of knowing when to leave space for things that needed to happen quietly. He'd been sitting there for 10 minutes when the black sedan pulled into the lot. Not an SUV this time, just a simple luxury car with tinted windows. The driver stayed in the vehicle as the rear door opened, and Sienna Elliott stepped out. She was dressed differently tonight. No suit, no heels. Just dark jeans, a simple blouse, and a leather jacket that looked expensive, but understated. Her hair was down, falling past her shoulders in a way that made her look younger, less like the woman who'd rolled onto his property with an armed escort. Tessa noticed her immediately. She set down the rag and crossed her arms, watching as Sienna walked to the door and pushed it open. The bell chimed, and for a moment, the two women locked eyes. Tessa's expression was neutral, but her posture said everything. This was her place, and strangers were measured before they were welcomed. Sienna approached the counter first. Good evening. I'm meeting someone. Tessa nodded toward the corner booth. He's been waiting. Sienna turned and saw Weston. He hadn't stood up, hadn't acknowledged her beyond a brief glance. She walked over slowly, her footsteps careful on the worn linoleum, and stopped at the edge of the table. Thank you for agreeing to meet, she said. Weston gestured to the seat across from him. Didn't agree to anything. You asked. I showed up. There's a difference. I showed up. There's a difference. Sienna slid into the booth, setting her bag on the seat beside her. Up close, without the buffer of security or the distance of gravel and porch steps, she could see the details. The lines around his eyes, the kind that came from squinting into the sun or the scope of a rifle. The scar along his jawline, faded but still visible. The way his hands rested on the table, loose but ready. Tessa appeared with a pot of coffee and 2 cups. She poured without asking, set the pot down between them, and walked away without a word. Sienna wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. I wanted to apologize for showing up the way I did. That wasn't the right approach. Weston picked up his own cup but didn't drink. You're used to people rolling over when you apply pressure. I'm not most people. I'm starting to understand that. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are trying to figure out how much truth they can afford to tell. Why do you need my land? Weston asked finally. Sienna set her cup down and met his gaze. The Northern Ridge is the access point for a development project I've been working on for 2 years. A sustainable resort community. High-end, but environmentally responsible. It's designed to bring jobs, tourism, and revenue to this area without destroying what makes it valuable in the first place. Sounds nice on paper. It is nice. And it's real. I've already invested millions. Permits, surveys, infrastructure planning. But without access through your property, the whole thing falls apart. The alternate routes add months and costs that make the project unfeasible. Weston leaned back, his expression unreadable. So you need me more than I need you? Sienna hesitated, then nodded. Yes. It was the first time she'd admitted it out loud, and the weight of the words settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. Then why should I help you? Weston asked. Not hostile, just direct. Because I'm willing to pay you more than the land is worth. Because the project will benefit this community. And because I think, despite what you might believe, we're not enemies. We just want different things. Weston studied her, his eyes sharp and assessing. You don't know what I want? Then tell me. He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. When he spoke, his voice was low but steady. I want to raise my son somewhere he can grow up without looking over his shoulder. I want him to know what it feels like to own something that can't be taken away by someone with more money or more lawyers. I want peace. And your project, no matter how pretty you paint it, threatens that. Sienna absorbed the words, feeling the weight of them in a way she hadn't expected. She'd heard 1,000 pitches, 1,000 justifications, 1,000 reasons why people wanted what they wanted. But there was something different in the way Weston spoke. No performance, no posturing. Just the truth, plain and unadorned. I understand, she said quietly. Do you? She looked out the window at the darkening sky and the valley beyond. I grew up in a house where everything was conditional. Love, approval, safety. It all depended on performance, on being the right version of myself at the right time. I spent my whole life building something that couldn't be taken away. My company, my reputation, my control. So yes, I understand wanting something solid. Something that's yours. Weston's expression softened, just a fraction. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was recognition. A crack in the armor. Tessa reappeared with 2 plates of pie, setting them down without comment. Apple, still warm, with steam curling off the lattice crust. She walked away before either of them could refuse it. Sienna looked down at the pie, then at Weston. Is this a peace offering or a test? Both, Weston said, picking up his fork. Tessa doesn't waste good pie on people she doesn't think are worth the effort. Sienna took a bite. The pie was perfect, sweet and tart, and exactly what she needed without knowing she needed it. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself enjoy something simple and uncomplicated. When she opened them, Weston was watching her. Not with suspicion, but with something closer to curiosity. You're not what I expected, he said. Neither are you. They ate in silence for a while. The tension between them easing into something that wasn't quite friendship, but wasn't hostility either. Outside, the last of the daylight faded, and the streetlights flickered on one by one. I can't give you the land, Weston said finally. But I'll think about a compromise. Limited access, specific terms, and a contract that protects my property and my family. No promises. But I'll think about it. Sienna nodded slowly. That's more than I expected when I walked in here. Don't get used to it. A faint smile crossed her face. Noted. She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card, setting it on the table between them. My personal number. If you want to talk, call me directly. No lawyers, no security. Just us. Weston picked up the card, turning it over in his fingers before tucking it into his shirt pocket. I'll be in touch. Sienna stood, leaving a $20 bill on the table, even though the pie hadn't been on any menu. Weston didn't stop her. She walked to the door, paused, and looked back. Thank you for hearing me out." Weston raised his coffee cup in a silent acknowledgement, and she stepped out into the night. The sedan pulled away, taillights disappearing down the road. And Weston sat alone in the booth, staring at the half-eaten pie and wondering what he'd just agreed to consider. Tessa came over and refilled his coffee. "She's trouble, I know, but not the kind you expected." Weston looked up at her. "No, not the kind I expected." Tessa smiled, just a little. "Good. You've been alone long enough, Weston. Maybe it's time you remembered what it's like to let someone in, even if it's complicated." Weston didn't answer. He just drank his coffee and watched the empty road, knowing that whatever happened next, things had already started to change. 3 days after the meeting at the diner, a late-season storm rolled into the valley without warning. The sky turned the color of old bruises, and the wind picked up with enough force to rattle windows and send loose branches skittering across the road. By mid-afternoon, the rain came in sheets, heavy and relentless, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud. Weston was in the barn when he heard the first crack of thunder. Ayla was inside the house, supposedly doing homework but more likely building something elaborate out of blocks. The horses were restless, stamping and snorting in their stalls, and Weston moved among them with calm efficiency, checking latches and water troughs. That's when he heard the car, not the roar of an engine racing up the driveway, but the strained whine of a vehicle struggling against mud and gravity. He walked to the barn door and looked out into the rain. A sedan, sleek and expensive and completely wrong for these conditions, was stuck halfway up the drive, its wheels spinning uselessly in the deep ruts. Weston grabbed his jacket and hat, pulling both on as he stepped into the downpour. The rain hit him like a slap, cold and hard, soaking through his clothes in seconds. He jogged toward the car, boots sinking into the mud with every step. The driver's door opened, and Sienna Elliott climbed out, her business casual outfit already drenched, her hair plastered to her face. She looked at the stuck car, then at Weston, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked completely out of her element. "I didn't think the rain would be this bad," she said, raising her voice over the storm. "You're not from around here," Weston said flatly. "This is what rain looks like." He moved to the front of the car, crouching to inspect the wheels. They were buried deep, the undercarriage resting on a ridge of mud. It wasn't going anywhere without help. "Come on," he said, straightening. "You can't stay out here." Sienna hesitated, glancing back at the car as if leaving it felt like abandoning ship. But another crack of thunder decided for her, and she followed Weston as he led the way toward the house. They reached the porch just as the rain intensified, drumming against the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers. Weston pushed the door open and stepped inside, water dripping off him in streams. Sienna followed, shivering despite herself. Eli appeared in the hallway, eyes wide. "Dad, there's a lady." "I noticed," Weston said. "Eli, go grab some towels from the bathroom, and maybe one of those old blankets from the closet." Eli ran off, his footsteps echoing through the house. Weston turned to Sienna, who stood awkwardly in the entryway, dripping onto the worn hardwood floor. "Why are you here?" he asked, not unkindly, but with genuine confusion. Sienna wiped the rain from her face. "I wanted to bring you something. A proposal. Terms for the access agreement. I thought if I delivered it in person, it might carry more weight than an email. In the middle of a storm. I didn't check the weather." Despite himself, Weston almost smiled. Clearly, Eli returned with an armful of towels and a thick quilt that had seen better days. Weston handed a towel to Sienna, who accepted it gratefully and began drying her face and hair. The warmth of the house was already starting to seep into her bones, chasing away the chill. "You should get out of those wet clothes," Weston said. "I'll find you something dry." Sienna looked down at herself. Her blouse was see-through now, clinging to her skin, and her jeans were caked with mud. She nodded, too cold and too tired to argue. too cold and too tired to argue. Weston disappeared into a bedroom and returned a moment later with a flannel shirt and a pair of sweatpants. "They'll be big, but they're dry. Thank you." He pointed her toward the bathroom, and she vanished down the hall. Weston stood in the kitchen, peeling off his own wet jacket and hanging on a hook by the door. Ailey watched him with the kind of curious intensity that only kids can manage. "Is she staying for dinner?" Eli asked. "Looks like it. Are we having the good mac and cheese or the regular kind?" Weston ruffled his son's hair. "We'll make it the good kind." 20 minutes later, Sienna emerged from the bathroom wearing Weston's clothes. The sleeves of the flannel rolled up 3 times and the sweatpants cinched tight at the waist. Her hair was still damp, but she'd pulled it back into a loose braid. She looked smaller somehow, less like a billionaire and more like someone who'd just walked through a storm and survived. Weston was at the stove, stirring a pot of something that smelled rich and savory. Eli sat at the kitchen table, coloring in a notebook with the focused determination of an artist. "Hope you like chili," Weston said without turning around. "I do," Sienna said, though she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten anything that hadn't been catered or delivered. She sat down across from Eli, who looked up from his coloring and studied her with the unflinching honesty of a child. "You're the lady who wants Dad's land," Eli said. Sienna blinked. "I am. Are you a bad guy?" "Eli," Weston said, a warning in his voice. "It's okay," Sienna said. She looked at Eli, considering the question seriously. "I don't think I'm a bad guy. But I think your dad and I want different things, and that makes it complicated." Eli nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Dad says complicated is just another word for hard work." Sienna glanced at Weston, who shrugged. Kids got good instincts. They ate together at the small kitchen table, bowls of chili steaming in front of them, cornbread on the side. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the house, it was warm and quiet. Sienna found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years, the constant hum of her phone and her schedule and her obligations fading into the background. Ailey told a rambling story about a frog he'd found by the creek, complete with sound effects and dramatic reenactments. Weston listened with the patience of a father who'd heard 1,000 such stories and would happily hear 1,000 more. And Sienna, despite herself, laughed. After dinner, Eli was sent to bed with only minimal protest. Weston and Sienna moved to the living room, where a fire crackled in the old stone fireplace. Sienna sat on the couch, the quilt draped over her shoulders, and Weston settled into an armchair across from her. "You didn't have to do this," Sienna said. "Let me in, feed me, give me dry clothes," I intruded. "You got stuck in a storm," Weston said. "What kind of person would I be if I left you out there? Most people would." "Then most people are idiots." Sienna smiled, a real smile this time, not the polished version she wore in boardrooms. "You're not what I expected, Weston Doyle. You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." They sat in silence for a while, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the storm began to ease, the rain softening from a roar to a steady patter. "I brought the proposal," Sienna said, reaching for her bag, which Weston had brought in from the car. She pulled out a folder, slightly damp but still intact, and handed it to him. Weston opened it and scanned the first page. Access rights limited to a specific route, duration capped at 18 months, financial compensation, liability protections, and a clause that required all work to be approved by him in advance. "This is fair," he said, looking up at her. "I'm not trying to take advantage of you. I'm trying to find a solution." Weston set the folder down on the coffee table. "I'll read through it properly. Talk to my lawyer. But yeah, this looks like something I can work with." Sienna exhaled, relief washing over her. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. I haven't signed anything." "Still, this is more than I hoped for." The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks up the chimney. Sienna pulled the quilt tighter around her. shoulders, and for a moment, she looked almost vulnerable. "Can I ask you something?" Weston said. "Sure. Why does this project matter so much to you? You've got money, success, everything most people dream of. Why fight this hard for a resort in the middle of nowhere?" Sienna was quiet for a long time, her eyes on the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. "Because I want to build something that lasts. Something that isn't just about profit or power. My father built an empire, but it was hollow. All transactions, no heart. When he died, I inherited it, and I've spent 10 years trying to turn it into something real. This project, this valley, it's my chance to prove that you can do good business and good work at the same time." Weston nodded slowly. "That's a better answer than I expected." "You keep saying that too." They talked late into the night, the conversation drifting from business to family, to the kinds of stories people tell when the walls come down. Weston told her about his time in the service, the things he'd seen and the reasons he'd walked away. Sienna told him about growing up in a world where everything had a price tag, even love. By the time the storm passed and the stars began to poke through the clouds, something had shifted between them. Not friendship, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. A recognition that maybe, just maybe, they were more alike than either had wanted to admit. The morning after the storm, the valley looked scrubbed clean. Sunlight poured through the trees, and the air smelled like wet earth and fresh grass. Weston stood on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching as a tow truck pulled Sienna's sedan out of the mud. She stood nearby, back in her own clothes, which had dried overnight by the fire. "I'll send someone to fix the ruts in your driveway," she said as the sedan was loaded onto the flatbed. "Don't worry about it," Weston said. "Rain does that every year. I'll smooth it out." She turned to face him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The easy intimacy of the night before still lingered, but the daylight brought reality back with it. "I meant what I said," Sienna said, "about the proposal. I'll wait for your answer." "I'll call you," Weston said. She nodded, climbed into the tow truck's passenger seat, and disappeared down the driveway. Weston watched until she was out of sight, then turned back to the house where Eli was already awake and demanding pancakes. 2 days later, everything changed. Weston was in town picking up supplies when he ran into Piper Stone, the reporter, outside the hardware store. She had her notebook out and a look on her face that made his stomach tighten. "Mr. Doyle, do you have a minute?" "Not really. I think you'll want to hear this." She pulled out her phone and showed him a photograph. It was grainy, taken from a distance, but clear enough. Weston and Sienna sitting together in the diner, leaning close over the table, the body language intimate. "Where did you get this?" Weston asked, his voice hard. "It's been making the rounds online. Someone posted it with a caption suggesting that you and Ms. Elliott have been, let's say, friendlier than the public realizes." Weston's jaw clenched. "That's garbage. I know. But perception is everything. There are already people saying you're being paid off, that the whole property dispute is just theater. Who's saying that?" Piper hesitated. "I can't reveal my sources, but it's coming from inside Elliott Global. Someone wants people to think this deal is corrupt." Weston handed the phone back, his mind racing. "Print what you want." "I don't care. I'm not printing anything," Piper said. "I'm giving you a heads up, because this is about to get a lot worse." She was right. By that afternoon, the photo had spread across local social media, shared and reshared with increasingly hostile commentary. Some called Weston a sellout. Others accused Sienna of using charm and manipulation to get what she wanted. The truth didn't matter. The narrative had taken on a life of its own. Weston's phone rang. It was Roland. "We've got a problem," the lawyer said. "Elliott Global just filed an amended claim. They're now alleging that you entered into a verbal agreement with Ms. Elliott during your meeting at the diner. They've got witness statements, timestamps, the whole package. That's a lie. I know it is, but they're playing dirty, Weston. This isn't about the land anymore. This is about discrediting you. Weston hung up and stared at his phone. The proposal Sienna had given him was still sitting on his kitchen table, unsigned. He'd been planning to review it with Roland, to make sure everything was airtight before committing. Now it felt like a trap. His phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. You should have taken the money when you had the chance. Weston deleted it, but another came through immediately. Small-town hero, big-time fool. He blocked the number, but the messages kept coming from different accounts, a coordinated attack designed to rattle him. That evening, Sienna called. Weston, I just saw the photo. I didn't authorize this. Someone inside my company is sabotaging both of us. You think I believe that? I don't care if you believe it. It's the truth. I'm pulling the amended claim. I'm going to find out who's behind this and fire them. Maybe you're the one behind it. There was a long pause. When Sienna spoke again, her voice was ice. If you really think that, then we're done. But I'm telling you, someone is trying to destroy this deal and make us enemies in the process. And if we let them, we both lose. Lose. Weston didn't answer. He just hung up. That night, he sat on the porch long after Eli had gone to bed, staring out at the dark valley. Somewhere out there, someone was pulling strings, turning a complicated situation into a war. And Weston had no idea who to trust anymore. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail. Weston signed for it without looking at the return address, assuming it was something routine from Roland's office. But when he tore open the envelope at the kitchen table, his blood went cold. It was a cease and desist order, issued by Elliott Global's legal team. The language was dense and aggressive, accusing him of harassment, defamation, and interference with legitimate business operations. It claimed that Weston had made threatening statements to company personnel and had engaged in a campaign to damage Sienna Elliott's reputation through false allegations. None of it was true. But the letter made it clear that if he continued to interfere with their operations, they would pursue legal action that could result in financial penalties severe enough to force him to sell the property just to cover the cost. Weston read it twice, his hands steady but his mind racing. This wasn't Sienna. He knew that much, even through the anger and confusion. This was someone else, someone using the company's resources to wage a personal war. He called Roland immediately. They're trying to bury you in paperwork, Roland said after reviewing the letter. This is intimidation, plain and simple. But responding to it will cost you money and time. And that's exactly what they want. So what do I do? You could ignore it, call their bluff, or you could fight back. But that means hiring additional counsel, filing counterclaims, and getting dragged through a process that could take months. Weston closed his eyes, feeling the weight of it pressing down on him like a boot on his chest. I don't have months. I don't have the money to fight a company with unlimited resources. Roland was quiet for a moment. Then maybe it's time to consider walking away. Sell them the easement, take the money, and move on. No, Weston, I know this isn't what you want to hear, but sometimes the smart move is the hard one. You've got Eli to think about. You can't protect this land if you're bankrupt. Weston hung up without responding. He sat at the table, staring at the letter, feeling something inside him crack. Not break, not yet, but crack. The kind of fracture that starts small and spreads if you're not careful. That afternoon, he drove into town to clear his head. He parked outside the diner, intending to grab coffee and think through his options. But when he walked inside, the atmosphere was different. Tessa greeted him, but her smile was strained. A few of the regulars glanced his way, then quickly looked down at their plates. He slid into his usual booth, and Tessa brought him coffee without asking. You okay? She asked quietly, not really. She glanced around, then leaned in closer. People are talking, Weston. About you and that Elliot woman. Some folks think you sold out. Others think she played you. Either way, it's not good. Weston felt the exhaustion settle into his bones. I didn't sell anything. And I didn't get played. I know that. But you know how it is. Truth doesn't travel as fast as gossip. He drank his coffee in silence, feeling the eyes of the town on him even when they weren't looking directly. By the time he left, the weight of it felt heavier than any pack he'd carried in the service. When he got home, Ailey was sitting on the porch steps, tossing the baseball into his glove over and over. He looked up when Weston climbed out of the truck, and his face was tight with something Weston recognized immediately. Worry. Hey kiddo, Weston said, sitting down beside him. What's going on? Eli kept his eyes on the baseball. Kids at school were saying stuff. About you. About some lady. They said you're gonna lose the house. Weston's chest tightened. That's not true. Then why are they saying it? Because people talk, Eli. And sometimes they don't know what they're talking about. Eli finally looked up at him, his eyes wide and searching. Are we gonna be okay? Weston wanted to say yes. Wanted to promise that everything would be fine, that they'd weather this storm the way they'd weathered every other one. But the words caught in his throat, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure. Instead, he pulled Eli close and wrapped an arm around his shoulders. We're gonna do everything we can to make sure we are. That's all I can promise right now. Eli nodded against his side, and they sat there together as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land Weston had fought so hard to keep, across the valley. In her hotel suite, Sienna sat in front of her laptop, staring at the internal audit report Kendall had just sent over. The findings were damning. Someone inside Elliott Global had been leaking information, manipulating documents, and using company resources to wage a personal campaign against both her and Weston. The name at the center of it all was Colin Shaw, her VP of Acquisitions, a man she'd trusted for 5 years, someone who'd been with her since the early days of the company's expansion. Kendall stood nearby, arms crossed. He's been working with a competing firm. They wanted the Valley project to fail so they could swoop in and buy the land at a discount. He's been feeding them information and sabotaging your negotiations from the inside. Sienna's hands curled into fists. Where is he now? I've already suspended his access to company systems. He's in his office waiting for you. Sienna stood, her face a mask of controlled fury. Good, let's go. The confrontation was brief and brutal. Colin tried to justify himself, claiming he was protecting the company from a bad investment, that Sienna's obsession with the Valley project was clouding her judgment. But when she showed him the evidence, the emails, the financial transfers, the coordination with outside parties, he had nothing left to say. You're fired, Sienna said, her voice cold and final. And I'm referring this to law enforcement. You didn't just betray me. You committed fraud. Colin left the building escorted by security, and Sienna returned to her suite feeling hollow. She'd won that battle, but the war with Weston felt further away than ever. She tried calling him. The phone rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. What could she say that would make any of this better? That night, Weston stood at the edge of his property, looking out over the land as the stars began to appear. Ela was asleep inside, safe and warm, but Weston couldn't shake the feeling that everything he'd built was slipping through his fingers. He thought about Sienna, about the night of the storm when they'd sat by the fire and talked like 2 people who understood each other. He thought about the proposal still sitting unsigned on his table, about the promise of compromise that now felt like a trap, and he thought about walking away, about selling the land, taking Eli somewhere new, and starting over where no one knew his name or his battles. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew he wouldn't. This land was his. This life was his. And he'd be damned if he let anyone take it without a fight. Inside the house, his phone buzzed with a text. He pulled it out and saw Sienna's name. I found who was behind it. He's gone. I'm sorry for everything. Please call me. Weston stared at the message for a long time. Then he turned off his phone and walked back inside, closing the door behind him. Morning came too early. Weston woke to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand, a relentless rhythm that dragged him out of sleep. He reached for it, eyes still heavy, and saw Roland's name on the screen. Yeah, he answered, his voice rough. We need to meet, now. There's something you need to see. An hour later, Weston sat in Roland's office, a cup of bad coffee cooling in his hand. Roland had his laptop open, and Piper Stone sat in the chair beside Weston, her notebook balanced on her knee. I've been digging into Elliott Global, Piper said without preamble. Specifically into the internal structure and who's been calling the shots on this Valley project. And I found something. She turned the laptop toward Weston. On the screen was a series of emails, time-stamped over the past 6 months. They were between Colin Shaw and an outside firm called Brookline Development Group. The content was damning. Plans to sabotage Sienna's negotiations, strategies to discredit Weston publicly, and financial projections showing how Brookline stood to profit if the Elliott Global project collapsed. Shaw was feeding them everything, Piper said. Proprietary information, survey data, even details about Sienna's personal meetings. He wanted the project to fail so Brookline could move in and buy up the land for pennies on the dollar. Weston scanned the emails, his jaw tightening with each line. Does Sienna know about this? She fired Shaw yesterday, Roland said. But I don't think she knows the full extent of it. And there's more. He clicked to another file. This one was a background report on Colin Shaw, compiled by a private investigator Piper had hired. The report detailed Shaw's financial troubles, a gambling problem that had left him deep in debt, and payments from Brookline totaling over $200,000 in the past year. He sold her out, Weston said quietly. And he tried to make you the villain in the process, Piper added. The photo at the diner, the social media campaign, even the cease and desist letter. All of it traces back to him. All of it traces back to him. Weston set the coffee cup down and leaned back in his chair, processing the information. He'd spent the past week believing that Sienna was either complicit or incompetent. Now he realized she'd been fighting the same battle he had, just from a different side. What do we do with this? He asked. We give it to her, Roland said. And we make sure Shaw and Brookline face consequences. But more importantly, we clear your name. Because right now, this town thinks you're the problem. And that needs to change. Weston nodded slowly. Set up a meeting. I'll talk to her. Piper leaned forward. And I'll run the story. But I need your permission to use your name and the details of what happened. Weston hesitated. He'd spent years avoiding attention, keeping his head down and his life private. But this was bigger than his comfort. This was about protecting his son, his land, and the truth. Do it, he said. That afternoon, Weston drove to Sienna's hotel. He didn't call ahead, didn't make an appointment. He just walked into the lobby, took the elevator to the top floor, and knocked on her door. Kendall answered, her expression wary. Mr. Doyle, I need to talk to Sienna. Kendall hesitated, then stepped aside. Sienna was standing by the window, her back to the door. She turned when she heard his voice, and for a moment, neither of them moved. I got your text, Weston said. I wasn't sure you'd respond. He crossed the room and handed her a flash drive. This is everything. Emails, financial records, proof that Shaw was working against you. Piper Stone is running the story tomorrow. I thought you should see it first. Sienna took the drive, her fingers brushing his for just a second. She walked to the desk, plugged it into her laptop, and began reading. Weston watched as her expression shifted from confusion to anger to something that looked like grief. When she finished, she closed the laptop and turned to face him. I trusted him. For 5 years, I trusted him. I know. And he used that trust to destroy everything I was trying to build. Weston stepped closer. He didn't destroy it. He tried, but he failed. Because you're still here, and so am I, and we can still fix this. Sienna looked at him. Really looked at him, and for the first time since the storm, the walls between them came down. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking just a little. For all of it. For the way I came onto your land, for the pressure, for not seeing what was happening inside my own company. You don't have to apologize for someone else's choices. But I do. Because it's my name on the company. My responsibility. Weston reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture that carried more weight than words. Then let's make it right. Together. Sienna nodded, and for the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe. The next morning, Piper's story broke. It was thorough, well-sourced, and devastating in its clarity. Within hours, it had been picked up by regional outlets, then national ones. Colin Shaw's betrayal became the headline, not Weston's supposed corruption. The narrative shifted overnight. Social media, which had been so quick to condemn, now flooded with support for both Weston and Sienna. People praised Weston for standing his ground, and Sienna for rooting out the rot in her own company. In Ashford, the tone changed too. Tessa called Weston personally to apologize for doubting him. Neighbors stopped by the property to offer their support. Even the kids at Eli's school seemed to move on, the gossip replaced by new, less interesting topics. But the real victory came 3 days later, when Brookline Development Group's CEO was arrested on charges of corporate espionage and fraud. The investigation into Colin Shaw widened, and the legal consequences began to pile up. Weston and Sienna met one more time that week, this time at his property. They walked the northern ridge together, surveying the land that had caused so much conflict. I still need access, Sienna said. But I want to do it the right way. With your full approval. No shortcuts, no pressure. Weston looked out over the valley, the place he'd fought so hard to protect. Then let's draw up new terms. Fair ones. And this time we both sign. Sienna extended her hand, and Weston shook it. The gesture was simple, but it marked the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Not just a business arrangement, but a partnership built on mutual respect and hard-won trust. The town hall meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening. But by 6:30, every seat was filled. People lined the walls, crowded into the doorways, and spilled out onto the front steps of the old municipal building. The air inside was thick with anticipation and the smell of too many bodies in too small a space. Ashford hadn't seen this kind of turnout in years. Not since the county threatened to close the elementary school, and the whole town had rallied to save it. But this was different. This wasn't about preserving something old. This was about deciding what kind of future they wanted. Weston sat in the second row, Eli beside him, the boy's legs swinging nervously under the wooden bench. Roland sat on Weston's other side, a briefcase full of documents resting at his feet. Across the aisle, Sienna sat with Kendall, her posture straight and composed, but Weston could see the tension in her shoulders at the front of the room. Mayor Patricia Vance called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. She was a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed. Someone who'd lived in Ashford her entire life and had seen administrations and businesses come and go. Good evening, everyone, she said, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. We're here tonight to discuss the proposed development project by Elliott Global Holdings and the concerns raised by members of this community. This is a public forum, which means everyone gets a chance to speak, but we do it respectfully. Understood? A chorus of agreement rippled through the room. The mayor gestured to Sienna. Ms. Elliott, you have the floor. Sienna stood, smoothing the front of her jacket. She walked to the podium at the center of the room, and every eye followed her. For a moment, she simply stood there, letting the weight of their attention settle. "Thank you, Mayor Vance," she began. "And thank you all for being here. I know there's been a lot of confusion and concern about what my company intends to do in this valley. So I want to take this opportunity to be completely transparent." She clicked a remote, and a screen behind her lit up with a detailed map of the proposed development. The resort community was laid out in careful sections, clustered housing units designed to blend with the landscape, green spaces that preserved the natural ecosystem, access roads that minimized environmental impact. "This project is designed to bring sustainable growth to Ashford," Sienna continued. "Jobs in construction, hospitality, and service industries. Increased tourism that supports local businesses, and significant tax revenue that can fund schools, infrastructure, and public services." A hand shot up in the third row. The mayor nodded, and a man in his 50s stood. "What about the land you're taking? What about the people who don't want to sell?" "That's a fair question," Sienna said. "And the answer is simple. We're not taking anything. Every piece of land we've acquired has been purchased willingly from owners who chose to sell. And for those who don't want to sell, like Mr. Doyle, we're working on access agreements that respect their property rights while allowing the project to move forward." Another voice called out from the back. "What about Colin Shaw? What about all the shady stuff that's been in the news?" The room went quiet. Sienna didn't flinch. "Colin Shaw was my VP of acquisitions, and he betrayed my trust in this company's values. He engaged in illegal activity to sabotage this project for his own financial gain. He's been terminated, and he's facing criminal charges. I take full responsibility for not catching it sooner, but I want to be clear. His actions do not reflect the integrity of this project or the people working on it." She paused, letting that sink in. "I also want to publicly apologize to Weston Doyle, who was targeted by Shaw's campaign of misinformation. Mr. Doyle has been nothing but principled in his defense of his property, and he deserves respect, not slander." The room shifted. People glanced at Weston, some nodding, others still skeptical. Weston kept his eyes forward, his expression neutral. The mayor gestured to Weston. "Mr. Doyle, would you like to respond?" Weston stood slowly, and the room seemed to lean forward. He walked to the podium, and Sienna stepped aside, giving him space. He looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people he'd known for years, and some he'd only seen in passing. "I'm not a public speaker," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "And I'm not here to tell you what to think. But I am here to tell you what I know." He gripped the edges of the podium. "When Elliott Global first came onto my land, I was ready to fight. Because I've spent my whole life learning that if you don't stand your ground, someone will take it from you. And I wasn't going to let that happen to me or my son." He glanced at Eli, who was watching him with wide, serious eyes. "But over the past few weeks, I've learned something else. I've learned that not everyone who walks onto your land is trying to take it. Sometimes they're just trying to find a path forward. And sometimes, if you're willing to listen, you can find one together." He turned to look at Sienna. "Ms. Elliott and I didn't start off on the right foot, but she's proven to me that she's not here to destroy this valley. She's here to build something that can benefit all of us if we let it. A murmur ran through the crowd. Weston continued. "I'm signing an access agreement with Elliott Global. It's limited, it's specific, and it protects my property and my rights. But it also allows this project to move forward. Because I believe this town deserves a future that's more than just surviving. We deserve a chance to grow." He stepped back from the podium, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then someone in the back started clapping. Slowly, others joined in, until the applause filled the hall. The mayor banged her gavel again, calling for order. Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Now we'll open the floor for questions and comments. For the next hour, people spoke. Some voiced concerns about traffic, about environmental impact, about whether the jobs would really go to locals or be filled by outsiders. Sienna answered every question with patience and detail, pulling up data, showing projections, making commitments in writing. Kendall took notes, documenting every promise, every concern, every suggestion. This wasn't just a public relations exercise. It was a binding conversation, the kind that would shape the project going forward. When the meeting finally ended, people lingered, clustering in small groups to continue the discussion. Weston made his way through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting claps on the shoulder, fielding questions from neighbors who wanted to know more about the agreement he'd signed. Sienna found him near the exit, Eli half asleep on his feet beside him. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for what you said in there. I meant it. I know. That's why it mattered." Weston shifted Eli's weight, the boy leaning heavily against his side. "This isn't the end, you know. People are still going to be watching, still going to be judging." "I know," Sienna said, "but we gave them a reason to believe. And that's a start." Weston nodded. "It is." They stood there for a moment, the noise of the hall fading around them. Two people who'd started as adversaries and had somehow found their way to the same side. Outside, the night air was cool and clear. Weston loaded Eli into the truck, the boy mumbling something about pancakes before falling asleep against the window. Weston climbed into the driver's seat and sat there for a moment, looking back at the town hall where lights still glowed in the windows. He thought about the past few weeks, about the anger and the fear and the moments when he'd been ready to walk away from everything. But he hadn't. He'd stood his ground, found the truth, and made a choice that honored both his principles and his practical needs. As he pulled out of the parking lot and headed home, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the naive kind that ignores reality, but the hard-won kind that comes from facing the worst and choosing to believe in something better anyway. Behind him, in the town hall, Sienna stood with Kendall, reviewing the notes from the meeting. "That went better than I expected," Kendall said. "It did," Sienna agreed. "But the real work starts now." Kendall closed her laptop. "You think he'll hold up his end?" Sienna looked toward the door where Weston had exited, a faint smile crossing her face. "Yeah, I think he will." And for the first time since this whole battle began, she believed they might actually pull this off. Not through force or manipulation, but through the kind of partnership that's built on respect, honesty, and the willingness to see each other as people instead of obstacles. The crowd began to disperse, filing out into the night, carrying with them the seeds of a future that hadn't been written yet, but was starting to take shape. And in the space between what was and what could be, something new was growing, something worth fighting for. 6 months later, the valley had changed in ways both visible and subtle. The construction on the northern ridge had begun, carefully managed and monitored by a team that included local workers and environmental specialists. The access road cut through Weston's property followed the exact path outlined in the agreement, marked by stone pillars that Sienna had insisted on installing, each one engraved with a simple phrase, "Built with respect." Weston stood on his porch one Saturday morning, coffee in hand, watching as a crew worked in the distance. The sound of machinery was faint from this distance, more like a hum than a roar. Eli was in the barn, working on a project of his own, building a treehouse with wood that Sienna's construction team had donated. A car pulled up the driveway, and Weston recognized it immediately. Sienna's sedan, the same one that had gotten stuck in the mud all those months ago. She'd kept it, claiming it reminded her of the night everything started to change. She stepped out, dressed casually in jeans and a light sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She carried a basket in one hand and waved with the other. "Morning," she called as she approached the porch. "Morning," Weston replied, setting his mug on the railing. "What brings you out here?" "Thought I'd bring breakfast. Tessa packed enough food for an army, and I figured you and Eli could help me make a dent in it." She climbed the steps and set the basket down. Inside were fresh pastries, fruit, and what looked like Tessa's famous cinnamon rolls. Weston raised an eyebrow. "You're bribing me with baked goods now? Is it working?" "Depends on whether there's coffee in there, too." Sienna laughed and pulled out a thermos. "Of course there is." They sat together on the porch steps, the morning sun warming the wood beneath them. In the distance, Eli emerged from the barn, saw Sienna, and came running over with the kind of excitement that only kids can muster for people they've decided are worth their trust. "Miss Sienna, come see what I built." Sienna set down her coffee and stood, letting Eli pull her by the hand toward the barn. Weston followed, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he watched his son chatter excitedly about measurements and angles, and how he'd figured out the best way to anchor the platform dot inside the barn. The treehouse frame stood propped against a workbench, rough but sturdy. Sienna examined it with genuine interest, asking questions that Eli answered with pride. "This is impressive work," she said. "You've got a good eye for structure." Eli beamed. "Dad says if you're gonna build something, build it right. Your dad's a smart man." They spent the rest of the morning together, the three of them. Weston and Sienna helped Eli carry the treehouse frame out to the old oak near the fence line, and together they hoisted it into place. It took patience and teamwork, and more than once they had to stop and recalibrate, but by early afternoon, the platform was secured and Eli was climbing up to test it. "Careful," Weston called, standing below with his arms ready to catch. "I got it, Dad." Sienna stood beside Weston, watching as Eli settled onto the platform and looked out over the property with the satisfaction of someone who'd built something with his own hands. "He's a good kid," she said quietly. "He is." Weston agreed. "He's been through a lot, but he's stronger than he knows. He gets that from you." Weston glanced at her. "Maybe, but he's also learning that it's okay to let people in. That's something I had to relearn myself." Sienna met his gaze, and for a moment, the space between them held all the weight of the journey they'd traveled together. From confrontation to compromise, from suspicion to trust. "I'm glad you did," she said. "Let me in, I mean. Me too." Eli called down from the treehouse. "Can Miss Sienna stay for lunch?" Weston looked at Sienna, a question in his eyes. She smiled. "I'd like that." They walked back to the house together, Eli running ahead to announce that they needed to make the good mac and cheese, not the regular kind. Weston shook his head, but he was already mentally going through the ingredients in the pantry dot as they reached the porch. Sienna paused. "I've been thinking about something." "Yeah?" "The project is going well. Better than I expected, actually. But I've realized something over these past months. The project was never really about the resort or the revenue. It was about proving I could build something that mattered. Something real." Weston nodded, understanding more than she was saying. "And I think I have," she continued. "But not just the resort. This, what we've built here. The trust, the partnership, the friendship. That matters more than any building ever could." Weston was quiet for a moment, then he reached out and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. "You're right," he said. "It does matter. And I'm grateful for it." Inside the house, they made lunch together, the three of them moving around the kitchen with an ease that comes from familiarity and affection. Eli set the table, Sienna grated cheese, and Weston stirred the pot. The rhythm of it all feeling like something that had always been and always would be. After lunch, they sat on the porch again, watching as the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills. The construction noise had stopped for the weekend, and the valley was quiet except for the rustle of wind through the trees and the distant call of birds. I never thought I'd end up here, Sienna said. Sitting on a porch in the middle of nowhere, eating mac and cheese with a Marine and his son. Life's funny that way, Weston replied. It is. But I wouldn't change it, neither would I. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Eli fell asleep on the porch swing, curled up under an old quilt. Weston and Sienna sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn gold, and then pink and finally deep purple as the stars began to appear. Thank you, Sienna said finally, for giving me a chance. For seeing past the money and the company and all the things that usually define me. For seeing me. For seeing me. Weston turned to her, his expression soft in the fading light. Thank you for proving that not everyone with power uses it to take. Some people use it to build. And that's worth believing in. They sat together as the night settled over the valley. Two people who'd started as strangers and adversaries and had somehow found their way to something. Neither had expected, but both desperately needed. A partnership built on respect, a friendship built on truth, and a future built on the kind of foundation that doesn't crumble when the storms come. Because it was forged in the fire of conflict and tempered by the willingness to choose trust over fear. In the distance, the lights of the construction site glowed faintly, a promise of what was being built. But here, on this porch, with a sleeping boy and two people who'd learned what it meant to stand together, something even more valuable had already been created. A home. A haven. A place where the walls came down and the heart could finally rest. And as the first stars blinked into existence overhead, Weston and Sienna sat side by side, knowing that whatever came next, they'd face it the way they'd faced everything else. Together. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.